Welcome to an AHRP educational session on applying for accreditation. AHRP offers a day-long workshop at our annual conference on how to apply for accreditation. In 2020, because of the COVID-19 public health emergency, we are providing this pre-conference workshop through a series of videos. In recognition of these unusual circumstances, we are providing these videos free as a resource to the community. We are extremely grateful for our presenters from the conference, who were excited to move forward and provide education through videos. We thank all of them for generously devoting their time and extensive experience. I will now turn it over to Andy Bertolatis from the University of Iowa and Heather Pierce from the Association of American Medical Colleges.
Thank you very much, Robert. We're glad to be with you all today and wish we could have been with you in person at the annual meeting. We're going to move into the first part of the presentation and explore Standard 1.6 on conflicts of interest. Standard 1.6 requires that the organization has and follows written policies and procedures to ensure that research is conducted so that financial conflicts of interest are identified, managed, and minimized or eliminated. We'll talk about the particular requirements of this standard and how institutions meet these requirements. So the two elements are here on your screen, and we'll talk about each of them in detail. But the most important piece of that is the first element talks about the potential financial conflicts of interest of the organization that could influence the conduct of the research. Whereas element 1.6b talks about the financial conflicts of interest of researchers and research staff. There are other aspects of conflict of interest that come into thinking about human subject protection and indeed are included in other elements of the accreditation standards, but these are the ones we'll focus on today. So first, let's turn to element 1.6a, and that is that the organization has and follows written policies and procedures to identify, manage, and minimize or eliminate financial conflicts of interest of the organization that could influence the conduct of the research or the integrity of the human research protection program. These are two separate considerations when you think about conflicts of interest that an organization may hold. And this concept is a little more complicated to think through than the financial conflicts of interest of an individual researcher or research staff. A financial conflict of interest that an organization holds could take many different forms. It could be that the organization has a relationship, a contractual relationship with an entity that is sponsoring or funding research, such that the research itself could be affected or could be perceived to be affected by that separate relationship. And that goes to the crux of what a conflict of interest is. Two interests that are potentially in conflict with each other. An organization also may invest in the company, whether it's a large company or a small startup company, that is conducting or supporting the research being conducted. If the research into, for example, a novel treatment or device is deemed successful and that company goes on to market the new therapeutic and make a lot of money, and the institution itself, that organization stands to benefit from that success, then we could suggest that the organization has a conflict of interest in the actual conduct of the research. Now, an organization doesn't conduct research, but employs the researchers and research staff that may feel unduly influenced to come up with research results that fall in the direction of their own employee organization. So how do we meet the requirements of this element? First of all, it's important to note that what we typically think of as institutional conflict of interest policies, that is, a policy governing how to deal with conflicts of interest held by the organization, are increasingly common, but they're not required by federal regulations in the United States or by most other types of organizations. So there's wide variation in what these policies look like and how they're implemented. Does the conflict of interest policy that governs the financial interests of individuals extend to the organization, and is it addressed by the same committees and structures in the same way? Is there a separate conflict of interest committee or process to look only at the organization? And one important piece is to think about who makes those decisions. If the organization has or is perceived to have a conflict of interest with respect to the conduct of the research, it might also be considered to have a conflict of interest in the review of the conflicts of interest of itself. And so the structure of that process is important. In many cases, but not all, institutional conflict of interest committees or processes may include individuals from outside the organization who can provide input on how to think about or manage these conflicts of interest. Importantly, this element does not require any specific structure or any specific implementation other than the ability to demonstrate that the policy in place is going to allow the organization to not only identify conflicts of interest, but then decide what to do about them. Just like with the individual conflicts of interest that we're about to talk about, that can include managing the conflict of interest or decreasing or getting rid of that conflict of interest. In an organizational conflict of interest, management could include putting up firewalls between the management of the organization and those who are doing the research. It could include requiring that a key member of the research staff come from outside the organization, or that data analysis happens elsewhere outside of the organization to ensure that the potential conflicts of that organization are not seen to be influencing how those data are analyzed or interpreted. In element 1.6b has two parts to it, and so we'll take those separately. The first part of this element is similar to part A, except instead of dealing with organizational conflicts of interest, this talks about individual conflicts of interest of researchers and research staff, and requires that the organization has and follows written policies and procedures to identify, manage, and minimize or eliminate those conflicts of interest that could influence the conduct of the research or the integrity of the human research protection program as a whole. In this situation, most institutions that are looking for accreditation, particularly in the United States, but in a growing number of countries, are very familiar with these kinds of requirements. In the US, federal regulations require that any institution that receives federal funds for research has a conflict of interest policy that has very stringent requirements that have been developed over several decades. And so in the in the addressing of individual financial conflicts of interest, many institutions have become quite sophisticated in both collecting that information, analyzing that information, and coming up with a way to manage those conflicts of interest or to minimize or eliminate them, as we spoke about in element A. The management of individual financial conflicts of interest can include involving other research staff to do parts of the research if it appears that the investigator or part of the research staff has a conflict with the outcome of the research. These conflicts could include a separate relationship with the sponsor of research. So you can imagine a researcher who does a significant amount of speaking or consulting for a company that also sponsors that person's research. She might be determined to have a financial conflict of interest because the outcome of that research could impact how that company treats her in the future in terms of invitations to do more consulting or speaking. Similarly, a researcher who has an equity interest in a company, whether that's a large company or whether it's a startup company that the investigator himself or herself is a major owner of, can all contribute to a financial conflict of interest that could cause us to question the integrity of the research. It's important to note here that the standard, the element of within this standard, talks about influencing the conduct of research or the integrity of the human research protection program. The management of conflicts of interest and looking at what influences the conduct of the research is wholly within the purview of a conflict of interest committee. Those conflict of interest policies that have been finessed over many years and are firmly rooted in community standards and federal regulations focus on the research conduct, but they're really looking for an impact on individual studies, on research integrity, on bias, and on human subject safety. Less evident is how a conflict of interest committee deals with a conflict of interest and how it could impact the integrity of the organization's human research protection program. Certainly they are related, but in thinking about how to address and demonstrate this element, the integrity of the human research protection program and how it interacts with the conflict of interest committee is really key. And that brings us right to the second element of the standard. We'll talk about that element in a moment. First, we will look at the second part of element 1.6b. And that is that the organization works with the IRB or the ethics committee to ensure that financial conflicts of interest are managed and minimized or eliminated when appropriate. That really goes to the crux of the issue that conflicts of interest are typically not identified or managed by the ethics committee or IRB alone. This is really in the purview of the conflict of interest mechanism at the organization. In a very small organization, it is often the case that the research compliance, the human research protection program office, and the conflict of interest review office are not only closely linked, but sometimes the same individuals or the same office. The larger that institution or organization is, the more separate the conflict of interest apparatus and the human research protection program are. So this really suggests that it's important that there's communication across these two areas of the organization. So the conflict of interest office, the IRB coordination, is essential and can be accomplished in many different ways. That might include having members of a separate COI committee sit on and be an active participant in the IRB, and also having either IRB members or HRPP coordinators sit in the conflict of interest committee as well. However the organization decides to approach that communication element, it's important that they do that. The management of financial conflicts of interest is typically a well-defined process. Whether the Institutional Review Board makes suggestions about management to protect human subjects or gets information from the Conflict of Interest Committee on how they recommend those FCOIs or financial conflicts of interest are managed or eliminated is an institutional decision, but should be well documented and well thought through. I'd like to discuss a couple other key considerations in conflicts of interest. These considerations may impact the function of the Human Research Protection Program and may require changes or addressing in conflict of interest policies and human research protection considerations. The first is a concern related to what's known as undue foreign influence. Over the last 2 years, this has been an increasing problem that has been addressed by foreign and domestic governments and agencies and is often put in terms of conflict of interest. In many of these cases, the worries are that an individual researcher has an affiliation with institutions from more than one country, and their commitment to doing research and providing research data to both of those countries without informing each other may not only violate conflict of interest standards, but could have an impact on the research itself. This has particular concerns for research involving human subjects. In response to these concerns, many institutions have been revising conflict of interest policies and human research protection policies to take into account what kinds of things need to be disclosed to organizations so that when researchers have affiliations with institutions in more than one country, the organization is aware of it and has guidelines in place to help manage whether they are actual conflicts of interest or beneficial research collaborations. A second key consideration is that there are public sources of potential conflict of interest information, an increasing number of sources that institutions would be wise to understand and to take advantage of to ensure that all of the information an institution is collecting about a researcher matches or is aware of those other publicly available sources of information. An institution that fails to think about or look into how the industry, drug and device industry, and journals are also reporting information about payments made to researchers and relationships with researchers, ignore those sources at their own peril. And increasingly, institutions are building in those kinds of reviews, if not into their policies, then into their conflict of interest review procedures. To the extent that those other sources are being consulted, then information should be flowing through from the Conflict of Interest Committee through the Human Research Protection Program. I will end with a note, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the standards do mention conflict of interest in a couple other places. We'll not go into those in detail, but I do note that the conflicts of interest of the IRB or EC members themselves are addressed separately and are important sources of consideration for conflict of interest. In addition, when researchers are making exempt determinations, it's important that those who have potential conflicts of interest are not making exemption determinations that could seem to be swayed one way or another. These are different kinds of conflict of interest than the financial conflicts of interest, but shouldn't be forgotten. And finally, the researchers and research staff need to disclose financial interests according to their organizational policies. And so this element, which will be discussed elsewhere, relates very closely to the elements we've discussed today, the standards about organizational policies on institutional and individual financial conflicts of interest. That I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, Andy Bertolatis, to talk to you about contracts.
Well, thank you, Heather. I'm going to continue our presentation today by reviewing with you the expectations that are contained in AAHRPP Standard 1.8, which deals with contracts that organizations have with research sponsors. I have two disclosures. I worked with AAHRPP for a while as a site visitor and more recently as a Step 1 reviewer, and I'm currently a member of the AAHRPP Council on Accreditation. I've worked with AAHRPP over a long enough period to know that this standard was not initially part of the AAHRPP accreditation standards, but it came into place during an update and expansion of the standard some years ago, when it was recognized that it would be a good idea to expect that organizations build into their contracts certain obligations that relate to the protection of human research participants. And the way it's stated in the introduction to the standard is that the organization works with public, industry, and private sponsors to apply the requirements of the Human Research Protection Program to all participants. There are 5 elements in this standard, and some or all of them do not always apply to every type of research. And you probably realize off the bat that not all research that is conducted under a contract. Much is not sponsored, or it's sponsored by entities that don't really have contracts governing the research. So moving forward, the first of the elements in this standard is 1.8a, dealing with research-related injury, or RRI. And the expectation here is that contracts should specify who, if anyone, is responsible for providing care for and paying for the diagnosis and treatment of research-related injury. And it's very important to note that this element does not require, in every case, that the sponsor pay, although that's desirable in many cases, but only that the contract deal with this issue clearly, specifically, and accurately. And this is really similar in my thinking to the common rule provision with respect to the elements of consent, that research-related injury be covered in the consent process as to whether it's available, whether treatment is available, and who's going to pay for it. And obviously there are some kinds of sponsored research where the possibility of injury is very small or non-existent. For example, we often encounter in many organizations research studies that are evaluating new diagnostic instruments that are being used on discarded clinical blood samples. They are not used in the care or diagnosis of patients. And really there's not any significant possibility of injury in that type of research, and we wouldn't expect the contract for that project to cover that. Moving on to 1.8b, this element deals with the results of monitoring visits conducted by the sponsors, which is a typical feature of most industry-sponsored late-phase research projects. And what this element states is that for studies in which the sponsor conducts monitoring, typically by site visits by the sponsor's own visitors or sometimes contract research organizations, the contract in these cases should obligate the sponsor to inform the organization of findings that affect the safety of participants or could influence the conduct of the study. For example, if the sponsor was finding at your own site that there were an awful lot of protocol deviations and other problems, you should be able to find out about that and try and correct the situation. The about these monitoring visits can be provided either directly to the organization or to the principal investigator at the site. I would say it's much more common that it's going to come to the principal investigator. And obviously this does not apply if there is no monitoring for the study. The next element is 1.8c, having to do with data and safety monitoring results. And although this sounds superficially a bit like the preceding element, this has to do more with studies that actually have an independent data safety and monitoring group or set of individuals. And contracts in that case should obligate the sponsor to provide reports from these monitoring boards to the organization, either directly or via the principal investigator. I would add that it should still be up to the IRB in its review to determine if the data and safety monitoring proposed is appropriate and adequate, or if none is proposed, maybe some should be in some cases. Element 1.8d deals with obligations concerning dissemination of research results and the role researchers might play. My own observation about this issue is that this has been around and has been dealt with in contracts for quite a bit longer than even the existence of the AAHRPP accreditation process. And during my own time as a clinical investigator, contracts have almost always, I think, dealt with this issue. And typically what is said in these sections of the contract that deal with publication are things like, for example, if it's a multi-center study, no one center should be out there prematurely presenting the results of the study prior to the end of the study. There are also the possibility is left open that an individual site might publish some interesting findings apart from the main object of the study that are observed at their site. In that case, there's usually a specified procedure for having the sponsor review the proposed publication over a period of time and making suggestions for editing or what have you. And so contracts generally cover this issue as we've gone through our site visits over the years. The final element in this standard is element 1.8e, having to do with reporting of results affecting safety of participants. And the idea here is that agreements should require reporting of results affecting participant safety even after the study has ended, optimally for a somewhat arbitrarily designated period of about 2 years, so that researchers or organizations can consider notifying participants if that seems to be appropriate. The general expectation, as I said, is this will extend for about 2 years. Most of us involved in the accreditation process would say that this particular element has probably been the source of most sponsor pushback, as sponsors that were initially, I think, often reluctant to take on this obligation extending beyond the actual end of the study. But it seems like this is becoming pretty universally accepted now and is finding its way into contracts the majority of the time. How is an organization going to meet the elements of this standard? Well, there are a number of common approaches. One is that most places that do a good bit of sponsored research have a clinical trial agreement or contract template. That is a template that they have constructed to contain things that the organization believes are either required or desirable, and that it can include the elements of this standard. And similarly, if your organization has master trial agreements, which are broad agreements with a particular sponsor that would cover just about any trial that you would do with that sponsor, that could incorporate the language and the concepts that are covered in this standard. And then additionally, most places try to deal with meeting these this standard by having a checklist for those in the institution who review and negotiate with sponsors over the elements of contracts. And that can include, among many other things, the desired AAHRPP issues. Finally, just a word about how this standard can apply to independent IRBs. Independent IRBs are in a bit of a different position than most organizations that conduct human subject research. That's because independent IRBs don't negotiate contracts directly with sponsors. They are not a party to these trial agreements. The organizations actually conducting the research and dealing with the independent IRB as their IRB of record, they do the contract negotiation. So the way that independent IRBs are brought into meeting this standard is that they're expected to have a process to require the organizations that come to them and use their review services to meet the elements of this standard. And that could mean that as part of the IRB application process, organizations have to specify how they, in turn, will meet the elements of this standard as they negotiate their contracts.
Thank you so much to Heather and Andy. We really appreciate your excellent support for human participant protections and AAHRPP during this difficult time. This concludes this presentation, but please check our website for other videos in our pre-conference series on applying for accreditation.